What happens when the world's most powerful military builds a weapon specifically designed to reach targets no other weapon in its arsenal can touch, and then refuses to clearly explain why? Because that is exactly the strange, unsettling situation unfolding right now. A new nuclear weapon, reportedly engineered to strike deep underground facilities that have long been considered untouchable, is moving through development, and the official explanations for why it exists keep shifting depending on who you ask. Before we go any further, if you actually want to understand what's happening in the world instead of just reacting to another headline, hit subscribe, right? Now, this channel breaks down the real strategy behind the biggest global power moves, and this one touches something most people never think about: the quiet, decades-long evolution of the world's most dangerous weapons, and what it means when that evolution suddenly accelerates. So stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand why a single weapons program can say more about global strategy than almost anything else happening in the news right now. To understand why this weapon matters, you first have to understand a problem that has quietly frustrated military planners for decades: the problem of the bunker. As satellite imagery and intelligence gathering improved over the past half-century, adversaries around the world learned an obvious lesson. If your most valuable military assets can be seen from space, they can be targeted. So countries serious about protecting their most sensitive programs, weapon stockpiles, command centers, leadership bunkers, missile facilities, started building downward instead of upward. Deep underground, layered in reinforced concrete and solid rock, positioned specifically to survive anything short of a direct, overwhelming strike. For years, the answer to this problem on the conventional weapons side has been massive, precision-guided bombs designed to punch through layers of rock and concrete before detonating. You've probably heard of these in the news: the enormous bunker buster bombs capable of penetrating deep into mountainsides before their payload goes off. Impressive as those weapons are, they have a hard physical limit. Beyond a certain depth, beyond a certain amount of reinforced rock, conventional explosives simply run out of destructive power. There's a point where no amount of precision or conventional payload can guarantee a facility's destruction. If that facility has been built deep and hardened enough, that's the gap a nuclear-capable Earth-penetrating weapon is designed to close. Unlike a conventional bunker buster, which relies purely on kinetic force and a conventional explosive charge, a nuclear weapon of this kind is designed around the idea that even a modest amount of nuclear yield, detonated at sufficient depth, produces enough underground shock energy to destroy structures that would otherwise be completely unreachable by any non-nuclear weapon in existence. In theory, it closes a strategic gap that's existed for years. The gap between what conventional weapons can physically destroy and what some of the world's most protected, most dangerous facilities actually require to be neutralized. This isn't a brand new idea. The concept has been debated inside American defense circles for over 2 decades, surfacing and then quietly fading depending on the political climate of the moment. A similar program was proposed in the early 2000s, generated intense controversy over its potential to blur the line between conventional and nuclear warfare, and was ultimately shelved before full development. What's different this time is that, according to multiple reports citing officials familiar with current weapons development programs, this concept isn't just being debated anymore. It's reportedly moving forward, quietly, as an active program. If you're starting to sense why this story deserves far more attention than it's getting, make sure you're subscribed, because we're only just getting into the strategic questions this weapon raises. And the next part explains why officials themselves seem unable to agree on what this weapon is actually for. It's worth understanding exactly how the earlier version of this idea died, because the reasons it was shelved 2 decades ago are almost identical to the concerns being raised again today. When a nuclear Earth-penetrating concept was seriously studied in the early 2000s, the program ran into 2 separate compounding problems. The first was technical. Engineers and scientists raised serious questions about whether any weapon, no matter how well designed, could actually survive the shock of penetrating deep into rock or reinforced concrete before detonating without the weapon itself, being damaged or destroyed by the impact before it could function as intended. The physics of driving any object deep into solid rock at high speed while keeping its internal components intact turned out to be extraordinarily difficult, and some outside physicists at the time argued the fundamental concept faced hard physical limits that no amount of engineering refinement could fully overcome. The second problem was political and diplomatic, and arguably mattered even more than the technical challenges. Congress ultimately declined to continue funding the program, citing exactly the arms control and escalation concerns we've already discussed. The fear that developing a nuclear weapon explicitly designed for a more limited, targeted use case would blur the line between conventional and nuclear. Warfare in a way that could destabilize deterrence relationships with other nuclear powers. That combination of technical uncertainty and political resistance was enough to end the program before it ever moved into full development. What's changed since then is worth sitting with carefully. Some of the original technical concerns have reportedly been addressed through advances in materials science and precision guidance technology developed for entirely unrelated conventional weapons programs over the past 2 decades. And the political environment has shifted considerably as well. A Congress and defense establishment operating in an environment of renewed great power competition with Russia and China, alongside continued proliferation concerns involving several regional powers, has proven considerably more receptive to nuclear modernization proposals than the Congress that killed the earlier version of this program. In other words, the idea didn't change. The environment around it did. Let's talk about what makes this weapon's purpose so genuinely unclear. Because it isn't just outside observers who are confused. The public explanation's coming. People in defense and policy circles do not fully agree with each other, and that disagreement itself tells you something important. One explanation, often described as the primary official justification, centers on deterrence against a very specific and narrow category of targets. Deeply buried facilities belonging to hostile states developing weapons of mass destruction, of a kind that existing conventional weapons cannot reliably guarantee destroying. Under this framing, the weapon isn't meant to expand the range of situations where nuclear weapons might actually be used. It's meant to close a specific capability gap so that the deterrent threat against a narrow category of facilities remains credible if an adversary believes their most protected facility is genuinely untouchable. Deterrence theory suggests they have less incentive to avoid provoking a confrontation over it. Closing that gap, under this view, is about strengthening deterrence, not lowering the threshold for nuclear use. A second explanation, offered less often but present in some of the public discussion, frames the weapon less as a warfighting tool and more as a signaling device, a way of demonstrating technological and strategic seriousness to rival nuclear powers who have spent recent years modernizing and expanding their own arsenals. Under this framing, the weapon's actual battlefield utility matters less than what its existence communicates, that the United States remains willing to invest in new nuclear capability, even in an era when arms control discussions have largely stalled and adversaries show little sign of reducing their own programs. A third explanation, and the one that generates the most controversy among arms control experts, suggests the weapon may reflect a broader, quieter shift in how nuclear weapons are being thought about at a strategic level, not purely as instruments of last resort deterrence reserved for existential threats, but as tools with narrower, more tactical applications against specific hardened targets that fall short of an existential nuclear exchange. If accurate, this would represent a meaningful shift in nuclear doctrine, since it suggests planners are increasingly thinking about scenarios where a nuclear weapon might actually be used in a limited, targeted way, rather than treated purely as an unusable weapon of absolute last resort. That three-way disagreement, deterrence gap filling, strategic signaling, or a genuine doctrinal shift toward more usable nuclear weapons, is exactly why this program's real purpose remains genuinely unclear, even to people who follow defense policy closely. And it's worth sitting with the fact that these three explanations aren't just subtly different. They point toward fundamentally different visions of how nuclear weapons fit into American strategy going forward. If this kind of layered analysis is exactly what you're here for, tap that like button right now. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who are tired of shallow headline coverage and actually want to understand the strategy sitting underneath the news. Let's talk about why arms control experts and non-proliferation advocates have reacted to this program with such visible alarm, because their concern isn't really about the specific weapon itself. It's about what building it signals to the rest of the world and what that signal might set in motion. For decades, one of the quiet, unwritten rules underpinning global nuclear stability has been a kind of shared restraint around developing new categories of nuclear weapons designed for more usable scenarios, rather than purely as instruments of last resort deterrence. The logic behind that restraint is straightforward. The moment any nuclear power develops and fields a weapon explicitly designed to be more usable in a limited targeted scenario, it creates pressure on every other nuclear power to develop something comparable, out of fear of being left with a capability gap of their own. That's the exact dynamic that drove much of the nuclear arms race during the Cold War, and it's the dynamic arms control frameworks have spent decades trying to prevent from restarting. A nuclear-capable bunker buster sits right at the center of that concern. Even if the weapon is never actually used, its existence changes the strategic calculations of every adversary who has invested heavily in deeply buried hardened facilities, specifically because they believed those facilities were beyond the reach of any weapon short of a full-scale nuclear exchange. Once that assumption breaks, those adversaries face a choice: Accept the new vulnerability, or respond by developing their own comparable capability, or by dispersing and further hardening their most sensitive programs in ways that could make future arms control verification even harder than it already is. There's also a subtler concern specific to this weapon's design purpose that arms control experts have raised repeatedly. A weapon explicitly designed to destroy targets associated with weapons of mass destruction development creates a strategic incentive structure that some analysts worry could actually accelerate proliferation rather than deter it. If a country believes its nuclear or chemical weapons program facilities are now vulnerable to this kind of strike, regardless of how deeply they're buried, the logic goes, that country may conclude it needs to accelerate its own program before facilities are complete and before diplomatic negotiations can catch up, rather than being deterred from pursuing such a program in the first place. Whether that dynamic actually plays out this way in practice remains genuinely debated, but it's exactly the kind of unintended consequence that makes weapons programs like this one so much more complicated than a simple military capability upgrade. Now let's talk about how other nuclear powers are likely to respond, because their reaction will shape the next phase of this story far, more than anything happening inside Washington policy circles. Reports suggest that both Russia and China have been closely monitoring the program's development, with officials from both countries offering public statements, characterizing it as evidence of continued American nuclear expansion at a moment when both governments have been pursuing their own significant nuclear modernization programs. That mutual monitoring matters because it plays directly into exactly the kind of action-reaction dynamic that arms control frameworks were designed to prevent. Russia has spent years developing and publicizing a range of novel nuclear delivery systems, some explicitly described as designed to defeat existing missile defense systems. China has been expanding its nuclear arsenal at a pace that has alarmed American defense planners for several years running, moving from a historically small, minimal deterrence posture towards something closer to numerical parity with the two larger nuclear arsenals. Introducing a new American nuclear weapons category into that already tense environment risks becoming one more justification each side uses to accelerate its own programs, regardless of whether that acceleration was the original intent. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about understanding the real strategic picture here instead of the surface-level version. Drop a comment and tell me which of the three explanations for this weapon's purpose you find most convincing: deterrence, gap-filling, strategic signaling, or a genuine shift in nuclear doctrine. Because I read these, and it genuinely shapes what we dig into next. Let's talk about how allied governments, not just rival powers, are reportedly reacting to this program, because their response reveals a different and often overlooked dimension of this story. NATO allies who rely on American extended deterrence, the promise that the United States would respond to a serious attack on their behalf, including with nuclear weapons if necessary, have a direct stake in how credible and how expansive that deterrent umbrella actually is. Some Allied officials have reportedly welcomed the program privately as evidence that the United States remains committed to maintaining a credible, technologically current nuclear deterrent, at a moment when several Allied governments have expressed concern about the reliability of that broader security guarantee. Other allies, particularly those with strong domestic political constituencies opposed to nuclear weapons entirely, have reportedly expressed private discomfort with a program that risks reigniting public debate over nuclear weapons policy, at a moment when many governments would prefer that conversation stay quiet. This split reaction among allies mirrors the broader ambiguity we've already discussed. A weapon whose stated purpose keeps shifting doesn't just create uncertainty for adversaries evaluating deterrence. It creates uncertainty for allies trying to understand exactly what kind of security guarantee they're actually receiving, and what kind of political and diplomatic costs might come attached to it. Let's talk about the domestic political dimension of this story too, because weapons programs of this scale rarely move forward purely on strategic merit alone. They also involve enormous defense industrial investment, congressional politics, and the institutional momentum of a defense establishment that has strong incentives to keep major modernization programs funded and moving forward regardless of shifts in the broader strategic environment. Nuclear weapons modernization programs, once funded and underway, tend to develop significant institutional momentum. Contracts get awarded. Specialized manufacturing capacity gets built and staffed. Congressional districts benefit economically from continued program funding. That institutional momentum doesn't determine strategic necessity on its own, but it does mean that once a program like this moves from concept to active development, the forces keeping it moving forward often extend well beyond the original strategic justification that got it started. Some defense analysts have pointed to this dynamic as at least a partial explanation for why the program's officially stated purpose has seemed to shift over time. Not because the strategic reasoning changed, necessarily, but because the institutional and political case for continuing the program needed to adapt to whatever justification proved most persuasive to the audience being addressed at any given moment, whether that audience was Congress, allied governments, or the general public. This is also where the ambiguity around the weapon's real purpose becomes strategically useful in its own right, whether or not that ambiguity was ever deliberately intended. A weapon whose purpose remains genuinely unclear to outside observers creates a kind of deterrent uncertainty that can be valuable in its own right. Adversaries planning around worst-case scenarios have to account for the full range of possible uses this weapon might serve, rather than a single narrowly defined purpose that could be planned around more precisely. Some strategists would argue that this ambiguity is a feature, not a flaw, that a weapon whose exact doctrine and intended use case remains uncertain forces greater caution from adversaries than one whose purpose and limitations are fully understood and can be planned around with precision. Of course, that same ambiguity is exactly what worries arms control advocates and, frankly, ordinary observers trying to understand what their own government is actually building and why. Deterrent ambiguity might make strategic sense from inside a defense planning office, but it comes at the cost of public accountability and the kind of open debate that democratic societies generally expect before their governments develop new categories of the most destructive weapons ever created. If this kind of honest, layered breakdown of world events is exactly what you come here for, make sure you're subscribed, because the next part goes into what actually happens next with this program, and why the timeline here matters just as much as the weapon itself. So where does this actually go from here? There are really three broad paths this story could follow over the coming months and years, and each one says something very different about how seriously to take the concerns being raised around it. The first path is that the program continues largely as currently understood, developed quietly, deployed eventually in limited numbers, framed publicly primarily as a narrow deterrence tool against a small category of specific hardened targets, without triggering the kind of visible arms race escalation that critics warn about. Under this path, expect continued ambiguity about the weapon's precise doctrine, occasional public statements reaffirming its limited defensive purpose, and relatively modest international reaction beyond the kind of routine diplomatic criticism that accompanies most major weapons programs. This is, in many ways, the path most consistent with how similar controversial weapons programs have historically played out. Significant initial controversy, followed by gradual normalization as the weapon becomes just one more part of an already enormous and diverse nuclear arsenal. The second path is that the program becomes a genuine flashpoint in the broader arms control conversation, used explicitly by Russia and China as justification for their own expanded nuclear modernization efforts, cited in diplomatic negotiations as evidence of American unwillingness to constrain its own arsenal even while pushing for constraints on others, and potentially becoming a significant obstacle in any future arms control negotiations that might otherwise have made progress. Under this path, expect this weapon to show up repeatedly in international diplomatic statements, treaty negotiation stalemates, and academic and policy analysis for years, well beyond its actual military significance, precisely because of what it represents symbolically about the state of global nuclear restraint. The third path, and the one hardest to predict but impossible to rule out, involves the weapon eventually being used or its use being seriously considered in an actual crisis, a scenario where a hardened, deeply buried facility becomes the center of a genuine confrontation, and the question of whether to actually employ this capability moves from theoretical debate to a real decision facing real decision makers. This is the scenario that makes this story matter far more than a typical defense procurement story. Every other weapon in the American arsenal capable of reaching similarly hardened targets is either conventional, with well understood and comparatively limited consequences, or nuclear in a way clearly reserved for existential, last resort scenarios. A weapon specifically, designed to make nuclear capability more usable against a narrower category of targets, is, by definition, a weapon whose actual use becomes at least somewhat more conceivable than the weapons that came before it. Whether that increased conceivability ever translates into an actual decision to use, it is impossible to predict with confidence, but the mere fact that it's a meaningfully different question than it was before this weapon existed is exactly why so many experts are treating this story with more seriousness than the relatively quiet coverage it's received so far would suggest. There's a broader moral dimension to this story worth taking seriously too, because it's easy to get lost in strategy and deterrence theory and forget what's actually at stake underneath all of it. Nuclear weapons occupy a unique moral category among the tools of warfare, precisely because of the scale of destruction and irreversible harm they're capable of causing, extending well beyond any specific military target to civilian populations, environmental systems, and future generations who have no say in decisions being made today. Every step that makes nuclear weapons feel more limited, more targeted, more like just another tool in a broader military toolkit, carries real risk of eroding the decades-long norm against their use. A norm that, imperfect and fragile as it's always been, has nonetheless held since the middle of the last century through multiple wars, crises, and near misses that came closer to nuclear conflict than most people realize. That doesn't mean every argument in favor of this program is made in bad faith or that everyone advocating for it is indifferent to those risks. Deterrence theory is genuinely complicated, and there are serious, good faith arguments that a credible deterrent against a narrow category of the world's most dangerous hidden facilities makes catastrophic conflict less likely, not more, by removing an adversary's false sense of invulnerability before it leads them into a confrontation they might otherwise have avoided. But there are equally serious, good faith arguments on the other side that any expansion of what nuclear weapons are designed and intended to do, however narrow and carefully framed, makes the unthinkable marginally more thinkable, and that in a domain where the stakes are effectively unlimited, marginal increases in thinkability deserve far more scrutiny and public debate than a quietly advancing weapons program typically receives. There isn't a clean, comfortable answer sitting at the bottom of this story, and anyone who tells you there is one is probably leaving something important out. Before we get to how this all wraps up, it's worth laying out the specific signals worth watching in the coming months, because these will tell you far more about where this program is actually headed than any single official statement. Watch congressional budget hearings and defense appropriations debates closely, since funding fights over specific line items tend to reveal far more about a program's actual priority and trajectory than public statements aimed at a general audience. Watch for any changes in how the weapon is described in official nuclear posture documents, since a shift from broad, general language toward more specific, narrowly defined use case descriptions would suggest the doctrine is solidifying, while continued vague language would suggest the ambiguity remains at least partly deliberate. Watch statements and program announcements coming out of Russia and China in the weeks following any major American announcement about this program, since their response, more than anything said in Washington, will reveal whether this is genuinely triggering the kind of reactive arms race dynamic that critics warn about. And watch international nonproliferation and arms control forums, including any statements from the International Atomic Energy Agency or major disarmament conferences, since these venues tend to be where the diplomatic consequences of a program like this first become visible, well before they show up in mainstream headlines. There's also a transparency and verification problem worth understanding here, separate from the strategic and moral questions we've already covered. Nuclear weapons programs of this kind typically develop under significant secrecy, for understandable security reasons, but that secrecy creates a genuine accountability gap. Outside experts, arms control monitors, and even many elected officials without direct access to classified briefings are often left piecing together a program's actual scope and purpose from limited public statements, budget documents, and occasional leaks, which is exactly the situation driving much of the current uncertainty and disagreement about this weapon's real purpose. That gap between what's publicly known and what's actually being developed is, in its own way, part of the story here. A weapon this consequential, moving forward largely outside public view, represents exactly the kind of decision that a healthy democratic process would typically want debated far more openly than current secrecy classifications generally allow. What we can say with real confidence is this: a new category of nuclear weapon, specifically designed to reach targets no other weapon in the American arsenal can reliably destroy, is reportedly moving forward through development right now with a publicly stated purpose that shifts depending on who is explaining it and to whom. That ambiguity might be a deliberate strategic choice, a reflection of genuine internal disagreement about the weapon's role, or simply the natural byproduct of a major weapons program navigating the competing political audiences it needs to satisfy to stay funded and moving forward. Most likely, it's some combination of all three. What we do know is this: for decades, the line between conventional and nuclear warfare has functioned as one of the most important, if quietly maintained, boundaries in global security. A boundary that has helped prevent regional conflicts from escalating into something far more catastrophic. Every weapon designed specifically to blur that line, however carefully justified, however narrowly targeted, in its stated purpose, changes the shape of that boundary just slightly. And in a domain where the consequences of miscalculation are effectively permanent, even a slight change to a boundary that's held for the better part of a century deserves to be understood clearly, debated openly, and watched closely by everyone, not just the small circle of officials and analysts currently deciding how to explain it. If this video helped you actually understand what's happening in the world right now instead of just watching it scroll past you, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe, share this with someone who needs the full picture instead of the 30-second version, and I'll see you in the next one, where we go even deeper into the stories actually shaping our future.